The Steel Tide, Guderian's greatest gamble. The year was 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, had transitioned from a sprint to a grueling marathon. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, found himself near the gates of Orel. He was the master of the fast Heinz philosophy: speed, shock, and decentralized command. But speed requires fuel, and shock requires parity. Guderian looked at his reports. He had roughly 400 functional Panzers, a mix of Panzer IIIs and the short-barreled Panzer IVs. They were worn, their tracks screaming for grease, their crews hollow-eyed from weeks of relentless advance. Then came the intelligence report that chilled even the most veteran Prussian officers. Joseph Stalin had unleashed the reserve. Moving toward Guderian's thin line were 3,000 Soviet tanks. It wasn't just a counterattack, it was a physical erasure of the German front. The moment of realization. As the dust clouds of the 4th and 11th Tank Brigades rose like a localized storm, Guderian's staff officers began to panic. The ratio was nearly 8-to-1. In the world of armored warfare, those aren't just bad odds, they are a death sentence. Guderian, known for his caustic wit and bluntness, didn't call for a retreat. He climbed down from his command vehicle, lit a cigarette, and looked at his distraught chief of staff. According to historical anecdotes and the memoirs of those present, Guderian watched the massive formation of T-34s and KV-1s, tanks the Germans were only just beginning to realize were superior in armor and firepower to their own, and muttered, "If the tanks succeed, then victory follows. But if they have 3,000 and I have 400, then we shall simply have to be 8 times better than they are. After all, a tank is only as sharp as the man inside the hatch." The clash at Mtsensk. What followed was not a clean tactical maneuver, but a brutal, terrifying scrap in the mud. Guderian knew he couldn't win a slugging match. If he lined his 400 tanks against their 3,000, he would be crushed by sheer mass. He utilized Kampfgruppe tactics, breaking his forces into small, highly mobile battle groups. While the Soviet tanks moved in massive, rigid waves, often lacking radios and led by inexperienced commanders, Guderian's tankers operated like a symphony of wolves. The ambush. Guderian ordered his panzers to utilize the reverse slopes of hills. They would pop up, fire at the thinner side armor of the T-34s, and vanish before the Soviet turrets could rotate. The 88mm secret. Realizing his Panzer III guns were bouncing off the Soviet armor like pebbles, he brought his 88mm flak guns to the front lines. These anti-aircraft guns became the Stalin killers, punching holes through the heaviest Soviet steel from 2 kilometers away. The command gap. Guderian stayed in his radio-equipped command vehicle, moving with the tanks. He could redirect a company in seconds. The Soviet commanders, hampered by Stalin's not-a-step-back orders and rigid doctrine, couldn't adapt when the Germans slipped behind their flanks. The aftermath. By the time the smoke cleared, the 3,000 tanks had not achieved their breakthrough. They had suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds of charred hulls littered the road to Mtsensk. Guderian had survived, but the victory was bittersweet. He wrote in his diary that night, acknowledging for the first time that the Ivan he had dismissed was a titan beginning to wake up. He told his superiors, "Up to this point, we had a technical superiority. That is now gone." It was the moment the Blitzkrieg died, replaced by a war of attrition that would eventually swallow the Third Reich whole. Guderian had proven that 400 could hold against 3,000, but he also realized that Stalin had 3,000 more coming behind them. The battle didn't end with a single volley. As night fell over the Russian landscape, the horizon glowed with the orange skeletons of burning steel. Guderian's 400 tanks were now less than 300, and the green Soviet crews were learning fast. The night of the ghost Panzers. While the Soviet commanders waited for daylight to utilize their numerical mass, Guderian pulled a move that would later be studied at West Point. He knew that if he stayed stationary, the morning light would reveal his meager numbers, and the 3,000-tank steamroller would simply flatten him. He ordered his tanks to keep their engines running. In the freezing dark, the German tankers performed leapfrog maneuvers. They moved in small units, firing flares and shifting positions constantly. To the Soviet observers, it looked like a massive German reinforcement had arrived. Guderian was playing a game of psychological warfare. He famously told his officers, "We cannot match their steel, so we must colonize their minds with fear." The T-34 shock. It was during this specific engagement that Guderian sent his famous panicked memo back to the high command in Berlin. This wasn't just a tactical struggle, it was a realization of a massive intelligence failure. The German Panzer III was armed with a 50mm gun, which Guderian watched in horror as it fired point-blank at the Soviet T-34s. The shells didn't penetrate, they shattered or ricocheted off the sloped armor. Guderian realized that while he had the better generals, Stalin had the better engineers. The Soviet tanks were wider, allowing them to float over the mud that trapped the narrow German tracks. The final stand at the ravine. As the sun rose on the second day, the Soviets launched a final desperate charge. A sea of 500 tanks charged a narrow gap held by only 20 of Guderian's panzers. This was the 3,000 against 400 myth made manifest in a single valley. Guderian didn't order a countercharge. He ordered his men to aim for the tracks. By immobilizing the lead Soviet tanks in the narrow pass, the Germans created a mechanical dam. The tanks behind them couldn't bypass the wrecks because of the deep mud on either side. It became a shooting gallery. For 6 hours, the valley screamed with the sound of high-velocity shells. The outcome. By the time Stalin's generals called off the assault, Guderian had done the impossible. He had stopped the breakthrough. But as he walked through the graveyard of tanks, he saw a Soviet tank commander, a young man, barely 20, climb out of a burning T-34 and attempt to attack a German tank with a handheld hammer. Guderian turned to his adjutant and said, "We have won the battle, but we have lost the war. We are fighting people who would rather die than breathe the same air as us." He knew then that for every tank he destroyed, the Soviet factories in the Urals were churning out 10 more. The fast Heinz was fast, but the Soviet Union was deep.
Key historical statistics of the encounter. Feature: German Panzer III/4, Soviet T-34/76. Armor: flat, vulnerable. Sloped, superior. Main gun: 50mm/75mm, short. 72.6mm, high velocity. Mobility: narrow tracks, stuck in mud. Wide tracks, all-terrain. Radio: every tank, excellent coordination. Only lead tanks, poor coordination. Guderian didn't just wait for Berlin to send help. He knew the bureaucracy of the Third Reich moved slower than a T-34 in high gear. He took matters into his own hands, initiating a technical revolution on the front lines that would change the face of tank warfare forever. The Emergency Commission, the T-34 shock. Shortly after the smoke cleared from the 3,000-tank onslaught, Guderian did something radical. He bypassed the usual military channels and demanded that a commission of leading German weapon designers, including Ferdinand Porsche and executives from Rheinmetall, fly directly to the front. He didn't want them in a boardroom, he wanted them in the mud. He forced these billionaire designers to stand next to the charred remains of both Panzers and T-34s. Guderian pointed at a captured T-34 and gave them a blunt ultimatum. Copy it. Don't try to be clever. Don't try to be German. Just build me that tank. The birth of the Panther. The designers were horrified. To copy a Slavic design was seen as an insult to German engineering, but Guderian was a realist. He saw that the T-34's sloped armor made it nearly twice as effective as the vertical plates on his Panzers. This direct intervention by Guderian led to the development of the Panzer V, Panther. If you look at a Panther today, it looks nothing like the boxy Panzer IVs. It looks like a T-34 on steroids. It had the sloped armor, the wide tracks, and a massive long-barreled gun. Guderian had successfully forced the German war machine to evolve or die. The White Ghost strategy. While waiting for new tanks, Guderian's 400 survivors faced a new enemy, the Russian winter. As temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, the German tanks froze solid. The oil turned to jelly. The Soviet T-34s, however, used compressed air starters and special cold-weather lubricants. Guderian's men had to light fires under their tank engines every morning just to get them to turn over. In one incredible instance, Guderian observed his men painting their tanks with white lime, chalk wash. This white ghost camouflage allowed his remaining 400 tanks to vanish into the snowscapes. He began utilizing hit-and-run tactics that the Americans would later perfect in desert warfare, striking from the white void and disappearing before the Soviets could range their guns. Stalin's fury. In the Kremlin, Stalin was livid. He had sent a 7-to-1 advantage to crush a single German general, and yet the fast Heinz was still standing. Stalin recordedly executed several of his own tank commanders for cowardice because they couldn't break Guderian's thin line. Stalin realized that Guderian wasn't just fighting with tanks, he was fighting with spatial awareness. Guderian was the first commander to use reconnaissance aircraft, the Fieseler Storch, as his personal eyes, spotting Soviet movements hours before they arrived and repositioning his 400 tanks to the exact point of the Soviet weakness. The tactical legend. How a 400 beat a 3,000. How did the numbers actually work? Guderian's secret was the finger of the fist. 1. Concentration. He never spread his 400 thin. He kept them in a tight fist. 2. The pivot. He would let the 3,000 Soviet tanks pass him, then strike their supply trucks in the rear. 3. Starvation. A tank with 3,000 rounds of ammo is just a metal box if it has no fuel. By cutting the tail of the Soviet snake, Guderian watched thousands of Stalin's tanks simply run out of gas and be abandoned. The final quote. As Guderian looked at the maps for the final push towards Moscow, he told his staff, "We are winning every battle, but we are being drowned in a sea of men and machines. The Russian doesn't play chess, he plays a game of hammers, and eventually the hammer breaks the sword. The atmosphere at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's hidden headquarters in the East Prussian forest, was suffocating. While Guderian's men were shivering in the Russian mud, the high-ranking officials in Berlin were still looking at maps with colored pencils, convinced the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Guderian arrived, his boots still caked with the gray dust of the steppe. He wasn't there to receive a medal, he was there to deliver a dose of reality that no one else dared to speak.
The confrontation, Guderian versus Hitler. Hitler greeted him with his usual maps, pointing at Moscow with a trembling hand. "We will take the city, Heinz," Hitler insisted. "The Russian reserves are exhausted." Guderian leaned over the table, his eyes fixed on the Führer. He didn't use the polite tone of a subordinate. He spoke with the authority of a man who had seen 3,000 tanks roar toward his lines. "My Führer," Guderian interrupted, "the Russian reserves are not exhausted. For every division we destroy, they bring up 2 more. Their T-34 is a masterpiece of destruction. If we do not change our strategy, we are not marching toward victory. We are marching into a giant Siberian grave." The room went silent. To suggest that the Untermenschen, inferior people, had better technology than the Aryans was treasonous in the eyes of the Nazi elite. But Guderian didn't care. He told Hitler that the 400 tanks he had left were held together by wire and prayer. The Iron Heinz sacrifice. Hitler, surprisingly, didn't have Guderian arrested. He was mesmerized by Guderian's tactical brilliance, but blinded by his own ego. He refused to allow a strategic retreat. Guderian returned to the front with a heavy heart. He knew that the 3,000 tanks he had just defeated were merely the vanguard. Stalin had moved his entire industrial base behind the Ural Mountains. While Guderian was limited by the capacity of German factories, Stalin was now receiving thousands of Lend-Lease trucks and supplies from the United States. Guderian made a choice that would define his legacy. He ordered his commanders to ignore stand-fast orders from Berlin if it meant saving their men. He transitioned from an offensive genius to a defensive magician. The tactics of the elastic band. With his remaining 400 tanks, Guderian developed the elastic defense. The trap: he would leave a section of the front intentionally weak. The lure: the massive Soviet tank formations would rush into the gap. The snap: once the Soviets were deep in the pocket, Guderian would swing his Panzers from the flanks, cutting off the head of the Soviet spear. In 1 week, using these tactics, Guderian's meager force claimed an additional 600 Soviet tank kills. He was fighting like a ghost, never where the enemy fired, always where they were most vulnerable. The end of the fast Heinz era. The "what Guderian said" moment wasn't just about a single quote, it was a philosophy. When Stalin sent those 3,000 tanks, he expected to crush Guderian's spirit. Instead, he forged the most dangerous defensive general in history. However, the weight of the numbers was undeniable. By late 1941, Guderian's health began to fail, and his relationship with Hitler hit a breaking point. He was relieved of command for unauthorized retreats, ironically the very retreats that saved his Panzer army from being totally annihilated. As he was being driven away from the front, he looked back at the smoke on the horizon and said to his driver, "They will remember us for how fast we moved forward, but history should remember us for how long we stood our ground when the world was made of T-34s." Why this story matters today. The encounter of 400 versus 3,000 remains one of the most studied asymmetric armored battles in military history. It proved that 1. Logistics beats bravery. Without fuel, the 3,000 tanks were just scrap metal. 2. Communication is power. Guderian's use of FM radios allowed 400 tanks to act as one organism, while the 3,000 acted as a blind mob. 3. Adaptability. The commander who admits his equipment is inferior, as Guderian did with the T-34, is the only one who can eventually fix it. After his dismissal, Guderian didn't fade into obscurity. He became a man obsessed with the Siberian giant. During his forced retirement, he spent his days analyzing intelligence reports that the high command had ignored. He realized that the 3,000 tanks he had faced weren't just a lucky surge, they were the result of a shadow empire of industry. The Secret of the Urals. In his post-war memoirs, Panzer Leader, Guderian revealed a shocking truth. While he was fighting those 3,000 tanks, he had sent scouts deep behind enemy lines and interrogated high-ranking prisoners. He discovered that Stalin had moved entire cities, factories, workers, and families thousands of miles east to the Ural Mountains. He realized that while he was meticulous about every nut and bolt on a Panzer, the Soviets had mastered the art of the good enough. Guderian noted, "The Russian designer understood that a tank only lives for 48 hours on the battlefield. Why build a clockwork engine that lasts 10 years when the tank will be a burning wreck in 2 days? They built for the moment, we built for a museum." The Return, Inspector General of Armored Troops. By 1943, after the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler realized he couldn't win without the man who understood the steel tide. He recalled Guderian and gave him a title that sounded like something out of a legend, Inspector General of Armored Troops. Guderian walked back into the halls of power not with a salute, but with a list of demands. He saw that the 3,000 tanks of 1941 had now become tens of thousands. His first act? He walked into the production plant for the Tiger I and Tiger II, King Tiger. These were the monsters designed to finally outclass the T-34. But Guderian was furious. He saw that they were too heavy, too complex, and too expensive. He famously shouted at the engineers, "You are giving me a sword of gold when I need 10,000 spears of iron. Stalin is winning because he counts in thousands, while we count in dozens." The what-if of the Ardennes. Guderian's influence reached all the way to the Western Front. In 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive, American tankers faced the Guderian style of warfare. Even though Guderian was focused on the East, his disciples, men like Hasso von Manteuffel, were using the same fist tactics Guderian had used against Stalin. The Americans, much like the Soviets in 1941, had the numbers, the M4 Sherman, but Guderian's doctrine of Schwerpunkt, the point of maximum effort, meant that even with a dying army, the Germans could punch through the Allied lines by concentrating their remaining armor into a single, unstoppable needle. The final lesson, the ghost of the 3,000. Years after the war ended, Guderian was interviewed by American historians. They asked him if he ever truly believed he could have beaten Stalin's 3,000 tanks with his 400. Guderian sat back, looked at his hands that had mapped the greatest armored movements in history, and said, "Tactically, we beat them every day. We were faster, we were smarter, and we were more disciplined. But you cannot defeat a mountain with a hammer. You cannot defeat a continent with a single army. Stalin didn't beat me with better soldiers. He beat me with the relentless math of the factory." The Guderian Legacy. Heinz Guderian died in 1954, but his shadow looms over every modern military.
The U.S. Abrams tank uses the decentralized command structure Guderian pioneered. The IDF modeled their entire armored doctrine on Guderian's fast Heinz principles. The 3,000 versus 400 scenario is still programmed into computer simulations at military academies to test if modern commanders have the Guderian nerve. Guderian proved that while numbers matter, audacity is the ultimate multiplier. He didn't just fight 3,000 tanks, he fought the very idea of impossibility. A final historical Easter egg. Did you know that after the war, the Soviet Union actually studied Guderian's memoirs to improve their own Cold War tactics? The very man who almost broke them became the teacher for their next generation of commanders. As the war entered its twilight in 1945, the relentless math Guderian had predicted finally caught up to the Reich. But even in the face of total collapse, Guderian's final moves were as controversial as they were brilliant. He was no longer just a general. He was a man trying to save a nation from being erased by the very steel tide he had held back at Mtsensk. The Duel of the Titans. In the final year, the 3,000 tanks Guderian had faced in 1941 felt like a skirmish. Stalin was now fielding the IS-2, Joseph Stalin heavy tank. It carried a massive 122mm gun, a cannon so powerful it didn't even need to penetrate a German tank to kill the crew. The sheer kinetic energy of the shell hitting the turret would crack the armor and cause spalling, sending shards of metal flying inside like a grenade. Guderian, now chief of the General Staff, looked at his maps and saw a nightmare. He had the Tiger II, King Tiger, a 70-ton beast that could destroy any tank in the world from 3 miles away. But there was a catch that made Guderian realize the war was truly over. He famously remarked to a group of Tiger commanders, "Our Tigers are kings of the field, but the Russians are the masters of the horizon. You will kill 10 of their tanks, and by the time you reload, 20 more will have emerged from the tree line." The final betrayal. In March 1945, Guderian did the unthinkable. He stood in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin and got into a screaming match with Hitler. The subject? The Kustrin bridgehead. Hitler wanted another suicidal counterattack. Guderian, seeing the useless slaughter of his remaining boys and tanks, refused. He looked at Hitler, the man who had ignored his warnings about the 3,000 tanks years prior, and shouted, "The men are exhausted. They have no fuel. Do you wish to fight the war with ghosts?" Hitler, trembling with rage, ordered Guderian into sick leave. It was a polite way of firing him before the end. Guderian left the bunker not with a salute, but with a heavy silence. He knew that the Soviet tanks he had first seen on the horizon in 1941 were now only blocks away from the Chancellery.
The surrender and the question. When the war ended, Guderian was captured by American forces. The U.S. Army didn't treat him like a typical prisoner. They treated him like a professor of war. During his interrogation, an American colonel asked him, "General, how did you sleep at night in 1941, knowing Stalin had 3,000 tanks and you had 400? Guderian smiled thinly, adjusted his monocle, and replied, "I didn't sleep. I listened. I listened for the sound of their engines, because in the silence of the Russian night, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the future." And the future sounded like a T-34. The legacy in steel. Guderian's story isn't just a tale of 400 versus 3,000. It is the story of the moment the world realized that industrial capacity is the ultimate weapon of the modern age. He was the first to master the machine and the first to be crushed by the sheer weight of its mass production. Today, the Guderian gap, the space between high-quality technology and overwhelming quantity,
is still the primary debate in the Pentagon and military headquarters around the world. As the final chapter of Guderian's military life unfolded, he transitioned from a man of action to a man of history. But there was one final, chilling confrontation that occurred behind the wire of a prisoner of war camp, a moment that revealed just how much Stalin had truly feared the fast Heinz. The Soviet capture request. Shortly after Guderian surrendered to the American 7th Army in May 1945, a strange request arrived from the Soviet High Command. Stalin himself had reportedly asked for Guderian to be handed over to the Red Army. Stalin didn't want him for a trial. He wanted to know the Guderian secret. He wanted to know how a man with 400 tanks had managed to paralyze 3,000. The Americans, realizing the intellectual value of the man who had essentially written the manual on modern war, refused. The Nuremberg defense. During the Nuremberg trials, Guderian was never charged with war crimes, a fact that remains a point of intense historical debate today. He was one of the few high-ranking German generals who managed to walk a razor-thin line between professional soldiering and the horrors of the regime. He spent his time in captivity writing. He didn't write about politics, he wrote about the mechanics of the soul. He argued that a tank is a dead thing without the spirit of the crew. In 1941, my 400 men believed they were invincible. In 1945, Stalin's 3,000 crews knew they were the masters of destiny. The engine didn't change, the heart did. The final vision, the Cold War architect. By the early 1950s, the Western Allies faced a new threat, the Soviet Union's massive armored divisions stationed in East Germany. The Americans reached out to Guderian. They needed the man who had looked into the abyss of 3,000 Soviet tanks to tell them how to defend Europe. Guderian's advice helped shape the West German Bundeswehr and the early defensive strategies of NATO. He proposed the active defense, small, highly mobile units equipped with anti-tank weapons that could bleed a larger force dry. This is the direct ancestor of the Javelin missile tactics we see on modern battlefields today. The man of iron, the heart of glass. In his final years, Guderian lived quietly in West Germany. He was often seen walking in the woods, far from the roar of Maybach engines. Shortly before his death in 1954, a young British officer asked him what his greatest achievement was. He didn't mention the fall of France or the drive to Moscow. He simply said, "I made the world realize that the future would be written in oil and steel. My only regret is that it was written in blood as well." He died on May 14, 1954, exactly 14 years to the day after his Panzers crossed the Meuse River in his legendary breakthrough of France. Guderian's Fast Heinz cheat sheet. If you were to take one lesson from his stand against the 3,000, it would be these three pillars. Pillar, principle, Guderian logic. Klopsen nicht kleckern. Boot 'em, don't splatter them. Never use tanks in small groups. Use all 400 at one spot. Führung von vorne. Leadership from the front. A general in a bunker sees maps. A general in a tank sees the truth. Funk ist Waffe. Radio is a weapon. If 400 tanks talk to each other, they are louder than 3,000 silent ones. The end of the legend. Guderian's 400 tanks are long gone, rusted into the earth of the Russian steppe or melted down for tractors. But whenever a smaller, smarter force holds the line against a massive, lumbering giant, the ghost of Heinz Guderian is there, monocle in place, radio headset on, reminding us that numbers are a fact, but courage is a choice.